afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Jo McAhose, and I am an educational consultant on the Nebraska NeMTSS statewide implementation support team. On behalf of our entire team, we are very excited to have you joining us today for our Nebraska NeMTSS Virtual Summit. We recognize that we are in unprecedented times and that as educators, you are being challenged in ways like never before. It is our hope that with information presented throughout our 6-week summit, we'll provide you with some opportunities to explore resources and information that can guide you in your own mental wellness and ultimately to consider the social and emotional learning and well-being of all of our students and families across Nebraska. Building relationships and partnerships is key to this very important work, which leads me to today and my distinct pleasure of introducing our two presenters. You all are in for a real treat as we will be learning about and exploring family, school, and community partnerships with Dr. Sarah Kubcik and Dr. Amanda Witte. Dr. Sarah Kubcik is an assistant professor in the Applied Behavior Analysis Master's Program at the University of Nebraska at Omaha. She completed her doctoral training in school psychology at University of Nebraska-Lincoln and her internship and postdoctoral fellowship at the Monroe-Meyer Institute. She is the primary investigator for a personnel preparation grant entitled Interdisciplinary Personnel Preparation in Systemic School-Based Behavioral Intervention through the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, Department of Education. Dr. Kubcik is a certified behavior analyst and licensed psychologist in Nebraska and has provided behavioral health and academic intervention services, including parent training and school consultation in pediatric clinics. She has conducted research and authored papers on academic interventions, parent tutoring, school consultation, and early intervention with diverse families. Her research interests include caregiver involvement in learning and home and school collaboration, so helping practitioners and teachers give parents guidance for helping their children with basic academic skills, extremely relevant in our current situation. Strategies for preventing and intervening to address problems with treatment integrity, for example, implementing plans or treatments as intended. And finally, school consultation for children with behavioral concerns. And Dr. Amanda Witte's work is focused on family-school partnerships, early learning, and rural education. In her role as research assistant professor, she serves as UNL project director for the Nebraska Multi-Tiered System of Support, a program that empowers schools to support and prepare all students for success by systematically delivering a range of high-quality instruction tailored to meet their needs. And as a member of our team, I know I can speak for all of us when I say we feel that it is an honor to be a colleague of Amanda's, and her research team's support in many capacities has been critical to our work with NeMTSS. Dr. Witte has also contributed to publications and presentations to promote understanding of the benefits of family and school partnerships. She has been instrumental in developing and implementing family and school partnership training and facilitating ongoing coaching. She provides leadership for federally funded and locally funded research studies, investigating factors that promote early learning and development, family-school partnership interventions to support social and emotional learning outcomes for children, and more recently, the effects of COVID-19 on parent-educator practices and stress. She received her master's and doctoral degrees in educational psychology from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So before turning it over to these two ladies, I do want to mention that a group of us will be managing the chat and Q&A features throughout the presentation, and we hope to provide an opportunity to address any questions or comments towards the end. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Sarah and Amanda. Welcome, ladies.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Mary Jo. I appreciate the introduction and the opportunity to be here today. So I'm going to go ahead and get us started, and then Sarah will take over at the end, but I'm sure Sarah will jump in at any time if she has anything to contribute or to correct any of the entirely possible mistakes that I may make. So welcome to our presentation. I will piggyback off a little bit of what Mary Jo started with in her introduction, is that we're very excited to be a part of week 2 of this summit. And so if you've had a chance to attend any of the other sessions, either in live while they were happening or on video. I really hope that you'll see the direct link between some of the other presenters and the work that we'll be talking about today. So if you think about other presentations on things like whole child or mental health policy or trauma-informed care, start to think about how family, school, and community partnerships can play a role in all of those things. And I'm going to particularly urge you to think about Celeste Malone's presentation on equity. She really set us up very nicely. She provided a lot of introduction on ways that on the importance of family and school community partnerships for ensuring equity. And I'm going to try to tie back some of what we talk about today to some of the great points that she made previously, because I think they're important for all of us to consider. So thanks so much for being a part of this. So if we go ahead and move to the next slide, I'm going to get us started. So I recently got some advice that if you are presenting to educators and particularly teachers, if you don't give them a practical strategy right away, you will lose them forever. So what I'm going with right here are a couple of two potential ways that you might foster partnerships. So even if you sign out after this, you'll hopefully take something away from our presentation. But one way that you can foster partnerships, and particularly family-school partnerships, is to assign one meaningful activity to students that engages their families. So I tell this story all the time, so those of you who have heard it, bear with me, but my husband is a high school English teacher. And when we first started hanging out, I mentioned that my line of research is family school partnerships and how important partnerships are. And he told me, oh yeah, I get family school partnerships. Whenever my students get a D or lower, the district requires me to contact their parents. So I only ever call dads, and I call over my lunch break so that I know that they won't want to stay on the phone too long. So not like a great model of family school partnerships, but the more I got to know him and the more I learned about how he taught, I did find that some of his proudest moments were when a parent would come to parent-teacher conferences or they'd have some other interaction and the parent would say, gosh, I don't know what you've done to my kid, but we can't talk about current events anymore. He's got a lot of good arguments that I'm no longer able to counter with. Or from his creative writing students, we can't watch TV together anymore because he's always thinking about imagery and how images that they're using and words that they're choosing are helping to influence how I feel. So he does now have plenty of opportunities where he actually assigns to his students opportunities to engage with their families around the things that they're learning in class. So that's one thing that you can do. Provide a meaningful activity that connects to what you're teaching your students and ask them to engage with their families on that. Another example, and maybe more salient for educators of younger students, but try to have one meaningful interaction with a parent that you don't already know. So potentially a parent who has a different background than yours. So I work a lot with families who have children with disruptive behavior disorders, and so tend to be sometimes challenging relationships between home and school. And so one great example that I have is between a family of a kiddo who was struggling, and the parent and the teacher ran into each other at the grocery store, and they had a wonderful conversation over selecting fruit. So the mom had really great tips for selecting how to pick out, I think it was peaches, maybe cantaloupe, something, picking out fruit, and really shared that information with the teacher. And that just broke the ice. That was their first opportunity to have a meaningful interaction that paved the way for a stronger relationship down the road. So those are my two tips. So hopefully those will get you started if nothing else. Okay. So although we've given you two tips, we do have some other learning objectives that we hope you'll take away from our presentation. So it is our hope that today educators will learn the importance of partnerships for students, parents, and teachers. They'll learn about some prerequisite conditions for fostering partnerships. They'll learn some behavioral building strategies or relationship building strategies. And the participants will gain a deeper understanding of their current partnership practices and attitudes, as well as some tools for building partnerships within your individual school settings. Okay, so you may have seen a graphic like this before, but I think it's always important to keep in mind that as educators, we always have the child or the youth at the center of everything that we do. So a lot of folks will use terms like child-centered or family-centered, and really always keeping in mind how this system impacts our work. So if you think about that green circle, you think about the family, that's where those kiddos spend most of their time, right? They spend a lot of time at home with their families. And then the second place where they spend a lot of time is at school, spend a ton of time at school, but then they're also engaging in their communities. And all three of these things intersect and overlap. So it's not only important to think about how their individual settings impact the child, but it's also very important to think about the interactions between those three circles. So how does the family and school partner together to influence the child? How does school and community interact together to influence the student? So that's more than just sort of a systems theory. The research also really backs this up. So just a quick note, Sarah and I are both researchers, so you're going to hear us refer to the research a lot, but hopefully in ways that make good sense and are practical for you. But one example that I have about how it's important to consider the relationships or the partnerships between the child setting is that on a number of the studies that I've done investigating how an intervention for children with behavior disorders works. So how does this intervention work? How does it get into the kiddo? We found that one of the most significant drivers of that intervention's success is the parent-teacher relationship. So if you think about that, both we know that what the parents did with the child in terms of behavioral interventions at home and what the teacher did with the child in the classroom, both worked. But what worked even more and really drove the success of that intervention was that change in relationship between home and school, that the parents and teachers learned to work better, and that really resulted in even better outcomes for the kiddo. So I mentioned research. It's probably no secret that you all know that there's a lot of good research that says family-school partnerships and family and community partnerships result in good outcomes. But I'm going to highlight a few things here because I think we oftentimes focus on the outcomes for children, but it's also true that the research is very clear that partnerships result in good outcomes for schools. So we see both improved things, so we see improvements in communication and problem resolution, as well as increased staff morale and retention. And then we also see decreases. We see decreases in tension and barriers between families and schools. Then we also see improvements for families, so increased self-confidence and empowerment, improved parenting skills, and then reduced disconnection or reduced uninvolvement, and decreased uncertainty from parents about how to support their own child's efforts. And then we see improvements for students, so grades, test scores, attendance, learning skills, attitude, social skills, homework completion. Then we also see reduced dropout rates, decreased need for special services or placement or punishments. Those are all really great. The research is also starting to show that family-school partnerships play a huge role in teacher job satisfaction. So we're seeing this in the literature that's coming out of staff shortages. So we're finding that schools that have good success in recruiting and retaining teachers are places that make strong efforts to involve families. So keep that in mind, right? So if we're making a case that family-school partnerships are important, keep in mind in all the ways that they matter and make a difference. Okay, so let's talk now about what family-school partnerships can look at or how we might involve parents. So on this slide, some of the things that we're talking about is how family-school partnerships can impact different aspects and how there are different ways of family participation, family engagement, and family partnership with schools. So schools can work with parents to help improve parenting skills. So thinking about what does parenting mean for children at different ages, and how can the importance of school be communicated at different ages. Also talking about communication. So lots of people like to communicate in different ways, so we'll talk a lot about communication in the rest of our presentation and identifying different ways of doing things. And then right in the middle of this table, you'll see volunteering. I like to think of this as sort of a classic, maybe the OG family school partnership, but volunteering is a traditional way, but it remains an important way of being involved in children's schools. But what I might encourage you to think about is different ways that volunteering might take place. So is it just participation on the PTA, or can it look different in different ways? Can you volunteer and encourage volunteering from families in new and exciting ways? And we also know that family school partnerships increase learning at home. And so I already gave a couple of examples about how you might increase learning at home, but think about it. So if kids spend a lot of their time at home, we can really give them a double dose of school if we're actively engaging and meaningfully engaging parents in their education. and even bigger. So if we pan out and think more broadly, decision-making. We can encourage and engage families in decision-making at all levels, so the individual child level, as well as making school-wide decisions for policy. And then collaborating with the community. There are lots and lots of ways to do this. And I think I do a lot of work in rural schools, but I think it's also true in urban or suburban schools that partnering with a community resources not only sets up the school community for preparing a workforce, but also improves the way we do business at school. So providing us with additional resources and ideas that make sure the schools fit the values and the needs of the community. Okay, so if you all have seen me or Sarah present in the past, it's very possible that you've heard us talk about the 4As. But I want to keep them in this presentation and continue to talk about them because I think we can't stress enough the importance of some background work that needs to happen to lay the groundwork for good family, school, and community partnerships. So we're going to spend a little bit of time on each of the 4As today and encourage you to think about other presentations that you've seen in the summit so far and think about how they may impact your individual school's approach, attitudes, atmosphere, and actions for partnership. So I'm going to go through each one of these one by one and continue to think about how these 4As are really the prerequisite. These are the things that have to be in place before we can foster true, strong family, school, and community partnerships in our own individual settings. So if we think about approach, so the approach is going to be the overarching perspective that schools and families are essential for student success. So I think a lot of times we think it's nice, it would be nice if they showed up, but we really need to reframe that to be, this is essential. Partnerships are essential, and without them, we will not see student success. We will not see students succeed to their greatest potential possible, and we won't see our schools improve in the ways that they need to. So in approach, we're talking about a shared responsibility for educating and socializing children. And here we're really keeping that emphasis on relationships. So you'll hear Sarah and I talk more and more about relationships and how key they are to true partnerships, that it's all about investing in relationships and taking time to ensure strong relationships for all parents. So that's not to say you have to be best friends. You don't have to hang out all of the time, but you do have to come to a place where you have strong working relationships. And I'll also say this, and I'll probably come back to it later, but you don't have to have perfect relationships with every member of a family at all times. But what is important is that we figure out ways to partner with someone most of the time from every single child's family. So think about that. Okay, so a couple of key strategies can we go back to approach? Key things to think about for approach. So things to keep in mind at this point. So here's where we think about honoring cultural diversity as an asset rather than a liability. Here's where we set comprehensive family school collaboration goals and with clear outcomes. So this isn't something that's going to be nebulous. We want to be really concrete about it in our approach. We really value families as partners and we seek their input when we're making decisions and we develop those relationships. Okay, now we can move on. So for attitude, this is all about beliefs. So firm belief that parents and teachers working together is more effective than us working alone. So that's going to be a key attitude in order to ensure that partnerships are really happening at your school. So we need to think, how much do we all believe that families have strengths, that parents can help their children succeed, and that there is no room for blame, that no one's at fault, that we all need to work together. So here's a good place. I was thinking about Celeste Malone's presentation, and she was talking about implicit bias. And in her presentation, she provided a really nice tool to help folks reflect on their bias and really think through ways that we might address it. So think about that when you're doing your attitude checks. Consider your bias as a part of that lens through which you view family school partnerships as well. So a couple of just sort of examples here. So things you might consider, assessing the leadership for culturally responsive attitudes. So we know the importance of strong leadership in all aspects of schooling, but especially for partnership. Another key thing that you could do would be to provide some potentially implicit bias training, but some types of training to encourage folks to reflect on their attitudes. Also continue to encourage your beliefs around learning as mutual, and to seek out help when you need it. Look for cultural liaisons or community leaders that can help you learn how to become a better partner for the parents and the community members in your area. Okay, so now let's talk about atmosphere. So in atmosphere, I used to talk about this as the physical signs or the way the school looks and the way, what kind of welcome signs do you have, what languages are represented in your building. And I think that that's still true. I think all of those pieces remain true. And I think just as much as the vibe that is sent out or the feeling that families get when they enter the school, that will remain important for as long as we have schools. But I think especially now that we're grappling with distance education and pandemic restrictions, I might encourage you to think about new ways to consider what the atmosphere of your school is. Where does school begin and end? Where is your campus? Here are great ways to consider what atmosphere you might convey if you're able to connect your school to the community more visibly. So holding events in places outside of the school. Go to where the parents are and develop that atmosphere as one that is connected with the school. And creating spaces, so clear spaces where parents can belong and be visible. Okay. So when we put all of those A's together, where we land is actions. So if you have a strong family school partnership orientation, a strong partnership orientation, then all of your actions will be done with partnerships in mind. So all of your actions then just become the way of doing business as one that invites and involves and sees as critical, strong partnerships. So here I've listed a handful of basic actions or examples of family school partnership actions, but Sarah is going to dive in to many examples and more in depth than I will here. But some of the things to think about for partnership actions are assessing family preferences. So there are so many ways of communicating. Are we doing it in the ways that they prefer? Sure, email is easiest for me because I sit at a desk all day, but maybe not the best for every family. Developing a systemic process for shared decision-making. This one's challenging. So we have a lot of decisions to make at all the levels of schooling. So figuring out how our system can encompass families in the community in our decision-making. Collaborate with families and equity experts to carefully review things like your curriculum, your instructional materials, your assessments, your student handbooks, your staff handbooks, your code of conduct, your master schedule, your all of your policies and structures. And I know Celeste Malone talked about some of these things too, but really going through all of those things and looking for bias, not only in the policies themselves, but in how they may impact unequally students in your building. And now think about how all of those things could be made better by partnering with families and communities. So other actions to consider, representation in your decision making, and then developing strategies for monitoring what kinds of collaborations that you do have. So we'll talk some more about actions as we continue with our presentation today, but just some things to get you thinking. Okay, so now this is an MTSS summit, so I want to talk about how we can consider partnerships in MTSS. So I think it works out really nicely for me that all of the NeMTSS materials are really set up with partnerships in mind. They are designed to encourage, require, and facilitate partnerships through all asks of your MTSS build-out, your multi-tiered system of support. So all I did here was just list the essential elements of NeMTSS. And so to get you thinking about how partnerships can be involved in all of those elements. So shared leadership, pretty straightforward. We're sharing leadership, right? So we're continuing to include parents and teachers in our decisions as we build our system. Communication, collaboration, and partnerships, that we're taking time and effort and resources to build strong partnerships for the good of all of our children. We're engaging in evidence-based practices. So curriculum, instruction, intervention, all of that. But another evidence-based practice is including families in your practices. So we know the research says that when we have good partnerships, we see good outcomes. So consider partnerships as one of your evidence-based practices. Building your capacity. So by including partnerships in the way that we do business, we're able to build the capacity of families and we're able to build the capacity of educators. And a layered continuum of support. So thinking about layers not only in terms of intensity, but also in terms of setting. So how can we layer the things children are learning both at home and at school and in their communities? And then database problem solving and decision making. You know, there's a lot of data on kiddos. Parents. So finding ways to connect with parents to be good contributors of information and data and using it when we make decisions. So one of the other things that Sarah and I wanted to do was be sure to leave you with a number of tools. You can't get all of this in a 1-hour session, but leaving you with a number of tools that you can go back to later on to continue to think about partnerships and build on your partnerships. And one tool that came to mind right away was the NeMTSS self-assessment. So this is something that everyone already has access to. You can go to the MTSS website, download it, fill it out. Those of you who are going through the NeMTSS training, you'll have access to it there. But I wanted to point out a couple of items on that assessment. So on the NeMTSS implementation planning portion of the self-assessment, one of the items on there is leadership team is engaging family and community partners to identify stakeholder needs, resources, and barriers to MTS implementation, and ensuring equity. And then another good place to look on the self-assessment is a whole item around family and community engagement. And it'll ask you to reflect on things like, have you defined and monitored family engagement? Are you linking engagement to your school goals? And how are you supporting engagement and partnership in your procedures? So you already have it. Mary Jo linked to it in the chat. So that's available as a super easy resource. That's one that's really great for thinking about your individual community and how things look right now. So just to kind of piggyback on definition and monitoring, I went ahead and just listed some items that you might consider in the next slide. Things to consider when you're making your definition of family school partnerships. So there's lots of definitions out there, and it's really important that you develop a definition that makes sense for your team. But keep in mind some aspects that are important in a partnership. One are relational processes. 2, that everyone are equal contributors. 3, that we have ways of sharing information, values, expertise, and goals. And mutual responsibility for supporting learning and success. And then for monitoring partnerships, there's lots of ways. I'm sure you all can do a better job of coming up with ways for monitoring partnerships, but I listed a few here. So ways to keep track of how your partnerships are going and how you can check if the goals that you've set are being met. So count the number of families attending off-campus events. You've held a school event, how many people came, and what student groups do they represent? What kinds of contacts do we have? And how do they look by student group? And what kind of ratio of positive to negative contacts are we seeing? Are they mostly negative? Are they like my husband who only reaches out when a student gets dropped below a C? What kinds of contacts are we having and how do they vary by student group? We can also ask parents, how would they rate their partnership with the school? And then potentially, how do parents feel about their own efficacy for working with the school and supporting their own child's learning? So just some things to keep in mind as you're thinking about how partnerships fit within your individual school and with your own deeply implemented problem-solving process.
Perfect. So I am going to jump in now, and I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about some of the actions that we can take when we're working with families. And one of the first ones that we can take is to provide professional development to our staff. So this is a recent survey from the Council for Exceptional Children, and what they found is that less than half of special educators report feeling very confident engaging diverse families. And you can see here on the graph that only 22% of special educators felt confident working with families that had a different language than English. And so when we look at these data, we can see that there is a significant need for providing that professional development. So we need to take a step back and consider what are the information needs that our staff has, and how are we going to communicate that on a regular basis for new staff and then also returning staff. And by staff, we need to think very broadly, from the classroom teachers to the paraeducators to the bus drivers. What is the information that they need to know to build these homeschool and community collaborations? The next step that I really want to emphasize is that we need to take some time to really get to know our families and to be able to seek input from them on what a family-school partnership looks like. So when Amanda was talking about what our definition of family-school partnership is for our school or for our district, we want to make sure that we're including families in that process. There are many things that can affect the homeschool collaboration and parents' skills and abilities in being able to become part of that child's schooling in many of those different ways that could range from the parenting to volunteering to learning at home. And parents are doing a lot of things that we don't always see as well. So we want to be able to learn how to capture that. So one area is just the work and time demand. So if we're working in a school where parents oftentimes have two jobs, or their parents, we have a lot of single parents, or we have parents that are from a certain, that they have certain time constraints after school, several kids living in the home. We want to be able to know that so that we can plan our activities that we're doing at school around some of those work and time demands and making sure that they are doable for them. Another thing is thinking about what are some potential stressors for your community. And this could range from the socioeconomic status to adjusting to a new culture or dealing with previous trauma. So if we have a refugee population, they may have certain experiences that they're bringing into that school setting that could be affecting how they're interacting in the school environment. Another is just education and language skills. So with this area, we need to consider what are the resources and how are we translating information to different languages to make sure that we really are reaching all the families in our school. Another one that I think we oftentimes forget to think about is the family's history or the parents' history with the educational system. So if we have a family who had a very negative history with education, it was they had teachers that they felt were mean to them, or they didn't feel like they learned as well as what they thought they could, that those can be things that they're bringing back into the school setting, or they may have attended a different type of educational system and need to learn about the educational system in the United States. Home resources are another one. So when we think about this from food and access to a safe home, childcare, access to libraries, books and materials. And I think right now, particularly when kids are doing remote learning, it's really important if we're giving children assignments or we want them to do certain activities to make sure that parents really have access to those materials at home. And then also thinking about values and expectations. And this can, again, go along with thinking about where families are coming from and what kind of culture they're bringing to the table. Just as a general example, collectivist cultures versus individualistic cultures differ quite a bit in thinking about. In the US, we really expect kids to remain on task with little prompting, and that may be different in a different cultural background. The next area that we're going to talk about is building trust and rapport. And this is just extremely important when we're looking at building those foundations for future work with families if we want strong partnerships and successful problem solving. One of the biggest things, and I think this is probably one of the most important, is making early positive communications with families. So this could be in the form of a personal note about the student, something that you value about the student or the family, making sure that we are trying to contact families with different modalities. So it may be by phone, seeing them in person, email, or a written note. And this is just one example. You can think about this from a parent perspective. If I were to receive a note like this, what that tells me about the school. So, dear Mr. Conrad, Caleb was such a great friend today. We had a new student in our class, and he was the first to offer to show him around the school and explain how our reading centers work. He also moved to the next level and then giving their contact information. And I think some of these notes can just really make a parent's day. So the next area, I guess one other thing with positive communication is to think about at higher levels. So when we get into middle school and high school, students have several teachers that they are working with. And that can be challenging for parents to figure out, which teacher do I contact for what? And so if possible, it's helpful to have a contact person for that cohort of students or for a specific group of students so that parents know specifically, if I have a question about these classes, this is my go-to person and they can help me navigate with those other teachers. The next thing is showing interest and a desire to learn about the family and to show an appreciation of the parents' input and ideas. And we can do this through a lot of open questions with the family. So we might ask, what does it usually look like when you're at home? Or to find out, what are the areas where you're concerned about your child, or what are their strengths so that we can incorporate that into the classroom. The next thing is figuring out how we're going to connect families with the relevant resources and support. So as a school system, it's important for us to be able to know what the community resources are that are available to our students and families. So having a list or a point person, this could be a family liaison or a social worker who helps families to navigate those resources and systems. It can be, as a teacher, when we hear about someone who maybe is food insecure or is struggling with housing, that can be a really hard thing to navigate. And so when we think about that professional development, if the teachers know, when you hear about these types of concerns, we definitely want to help connect families with those resources. And these are the ways that our school can help to be able to do that. It kind of takes a little bit of the guesswork or the seeking of different resources that if we have kind of a one-stop shop, so to speak, for finding out about those resources, it can help. And it also lets the teacher know that these resources are available, especially if they're new to the community, to be able to have kind of that list of resources. Another area, and Amanda talked a little bit about this earlier, is really connecting with community leaders. When we think about community leaders, they are people that have really positive rapport and trust built in within the community. And so when we bring those people in and we help to be able to assess, what are the needs of the community and how we can work together to support that. So I wanted to share a quick example of this. A few years ago, I was working with a group of refugee families. And when we think about refugee families, due to how resettlement works, those families that are from specific regions are often placed in the same community. And so those groups of individuals can sometimes find ways to be able to collaborate, or they might engage in similar activities with one another. And so what we did is we found where those leaders were, and we went to, it was through a church actually, and so there were several families that were attending. We met with the church, or the leader of that group, and then we also talked about what are the needs, related to education and some ways that we could collaborate. And we were able to put together an early learning system, or I guess groups for early literacy with some of the kids. And so rather than the families having to come to us at times that were inconvenient, so they weren't going to be able to make it after school, before school, those times weren't going to work for them, we went to the families. And then the other community organization that we worked with was the library. So when we think about those connections in the community, we did some meetings at the library where all the kids were able to get library cards, and it was just a really fun collaboration to have those three entities working together to, one, build I guess the capacity of the group of individuals, and then to also make sure that they were getting connected to resources, and then in addition, learning skills for how they could facilitate those early learning opportunities for their kids at home. Okay, so we've taken some time to get to know our families, and now we want to be able to use that information to establish systems, and it could also inform the training that we're giving to our teachers. So when we're building our systems, some things that we might consider would be a family resource center. And this could be something that could be in the school, it could be resources online, but just a place for families to be able to go, to be able to get information and resources and have a regular connection there. Another is finding that information about community resources. And with that, it could include things like food, insurance, job training for older kids, or volunteer opportunities. And then also looking at establishing opportunities for parents to be involved on a regular basis. When we think about those opportunities, we want them to be pretty diverse. So not always coming to the classroom. We could give opportunities for before, after school, or things that families can do at home. And it could be any of those keys that we previously talked about. One thing that I will say about inviting families is to try to make those invitations really specific to the families. And sometimes we cannot even involve the children in making those invitations. One of my friends, I think a good example of this is one of my friends was talking about how the school had sent an email, how the parents could come in and do some activities. And she was kind of hesitant to do that. But then as we were talking, if she had a better relationship or a more in-depth relationship with another parent or with that teacher, or the child had invited them, then they probably would have come to that invitation. So it's kind of like if you have a closer friend, you're more likely to follow up on those invitations than you would if you were not as familiar with that person. The last thing is trying to provide clear and concise communication. So what are the regular ways that we are going to communicate with parents? It could be a specific folder that's sent home each week. We can also try to gather information about how families prefer for that communication to happen, if they prefer an app, or if they prefer phone calls, or written information or emails, and then try to follow that method whenever possible. The last thing with being concise, sometimes we can get kind of wordy in our communications, and when parents pull out that content, they really want to know, like, what are the highlights? What are the main things that I need to know? And we want to make sure that that information, again, is at an appropriate level of reading, and then also in the language that the family uses at home. As we're still in Tier 1, there's a lot of work to do in Tier 1. So when we're looking at Tier 1, we also want to provide information about NeMTSS. We love acronyms in education. And so if a family hears NeMTSS, they may not know what that is. And so we want to make sure that the beginning of each year and periodically throughout the year that we are providing information about multi-tiered systems of supports for the families, and covering information like the procedures that we use at the school, how supports are provided at school, explaining information when we decide if a student needs extra support, and then also if parents have questions, who do they contact, or if they want to give input, how do they go about doing that? Because when parents have an understanding of this overall system that's being used in the school, it's not as surprising when they start to hear some of that language, or they start to see how that works for their child if they do need additional support. Another area is providing information about general behavioral expectations and about the curriculum in the home. And so we can, one, talk about, what are the school lessons and provide those to parents that they can use, provide strategies for parents to use that are similar to those at school. And we can also try to give really clear guidance on how parents can support learning. So sometimes we'll send things home that say, read for 30 minutes. And parents, I think, so one, what should they be reading? Is this okay for them to read? Is the reading at the right level? What if they get stuck on words? What if the homework is too difficult? So thinking about, how do we provide more specific guidance? And with that, to inform that guidance, we can ask for input from families through that feedback and finding, what are their support needs. Okay, so if we've done a really good job at Tier 1, establishing general collaborations with parents and really partnering with them through this process and providing information and getting input, then when we move to Tier 2, we're going to be in a lot better place to work effectively with kids. And one thing as we move to Tier 2 is that we really want to make sure that we are involving families early on in the process. So just as an example, we might have contact with a parent early on saying, I noticed that addition facts have been challenging for Mandy. Right now we're doing these interventions to help her, and then giving the parent an opportunity to provide some of that input. So, like, what have you noticed at home? How is she doing when you're working with her on those math facts? And then letting them know, I'm going to keep you updated on how things are going at school, and then we can work together to provide, to think about those next steps, and we'll see how she progresses and if we need to do anything else to make sure that she is being successful with those math facts. So having a conversation like that really helps to give the parent a lot of information and is bringing them onto this collaboration early on so that we're seeking input from them and that they know that, this is something that we're also concerned about, but we're all going to continue to work together to make sure that your child is successful. And that's the parent's goal as well. So with that, when we are doing any assessment for kids, we want to make sure that we're giving that information about assessments in a parent-friendly language. Amanda and I were talking a little bit about this, and sometimes when we're in education, and I mean this is true of any field really, that we start to use a certain language and we start to use jargon, and sometimes we don't even realize that we are using jargon. And so if we sit down to talk with a parent about maybe some of the curriculum-based measures that we're using or some of the assessments that we're doing in class or what level they're on, maybe they're on level M in reading, what does that actually mean and how did you figure out that that's the level that they were on? So making sure that in general, we're trying to provide that information in a parent-friendly way, kind of describing what the student had to do during the assessment, why that information was collected, and what it really means and how it's going to help us move forward in this process. Another area is making sure, as Amanda said earlier as well, that we really want to get data from parents. And this could be informal information, what have you noticed when you're working on this with homework, or tell me about how math has gone in previous classes. And then to make sure that we're including and incorporating that data into the problem solving process. So we want parents to hear that that information is really important, and I'm taking note of that information as we move forward in our problem solving. As we do start to set goals, we want to make sure that we set goals that are measurable. And when we put together that intervention plan, it's helpful if we can provide some choice when possible, because providing that choice allows parents to be part of that decision. So rather than going into the meeting and saying, these are the goals that we set and this is the intervention that we're going to do, we can have kind of a little bit different conversation to say, so this is our assessment information. These are the goals that we have based on this information, and this is why we think that this is a good goal. And then move into, this is kind of the intervention plan that we were thinking about, and to tell why we think that is. And if we have a couple of different options, so if we have a kid who's, they're having some problem behavior and it seems like they're doing it to get out of their work, we can keep that in mind, but those breaks that we're building in for that child could look at many different ways. And so that brings the parent and the teacher into that conversation to figure out how that intervention is going to best fit in their specific environment. Another area is, as we move to Tier 2, there may be some concerns with attendance or homework and community services. And so we might also intensify the general services and supports that we're providing to the families at this level. I also wanted to note that when we are talking with families about the interventions that we're doing in the school setting, we can also provide some information about ways that they can support that learning at home. Because parents are oftentimes in our work, they're trying to figure out, like, I know that they're behind on their addition, and so I'm trying to do this, but it's just really frustrating. So if we can give them some specific instructions with a rationale on how they can help that process to work more effectively and to be more positive, we can model those strategies. So I've seen sometimes we've sent home a video of what something can look like for a particular kid, or practice those strategies with the parent and provide them with feedback, and most importantly, support. Because when families feel that they are supported, they are more confident, and also their stress decreases, which is also helpful when we have those interactions between the parent and the child when they're working on strategies or learning at home. A couple of areas with Tier 2 is that we, again, want to make sure that we're really focusing on student progress and success. It's really easy as concerns come up that we can start to feel kind of overwhelmed, or our emotions become a little bit higher because the initial strategies weren't working the way that we would like them to, or they weren't a good fit for that student. And so as we move forward, we want to make sure that when we're communicating information that we are really focused on, it was great to see, their progress today, and sharing that information on progress monitoring with families. We can also involve families in our Tier 2 interventions. So for example, with check-in, check-out, we can incorporate some parent or home components with that. Or in small group interventions, we can try to identify interventions that are needed in our school. So for example, if we have a small group related to social anxiety, or related to depression, or other social emotional functioning enhancement interventions, we can try to select ones that have a family component, and to be able to figure out how that works for our families, to be able to incorporate them to support the students and reinforce those skills that they're working on at school. The last point here has to do with promoting family-to-family support. And this is, I think, an increasing area of research. And what we find is that it's beneficial because families are able to share information, discuss strategies that they've used, and they also are able to learn from one another on how to advocate for their child, and most importantly, support one another through the process. Okay, so with Tier 2, our overall goal was to include the families at a higher level, and to be able to share more information, and to be able to share those data and resources and collaborate on interventions. And so as we move into Tier 3, we're going to continue to intensify that involvement and support. I brought up these 2 points because I think it's really helpful for us to think about where families are coming from as we intensify our services. And parents of children with disabilities really report kind of general dissatisfaction with the IEP process. They feel oftentimes that they're not equal members of a team, or that their input and perspectives are not valued. And then they also show uncertainty about how to support those children's learning at home to meet those academic goals. And so we really can work with families to make sure that this is not the case in our school, that we want families to feel that they are equal members of the team, and that their perspectives and input are really valued. And we're going to talk about some ways that we can do that as we structure our meetings. So again, we're going to intensify those family-school partnerships. And we again want to make sure that parents are really clear partners in every step of the problem-solving process. And that the recognition and letting them know that they really are experts on their child. They are the one constant for this child throughout. And so it's really important that they fully understand the plans that are happening at school, because they're going to have new teachers or new staff working with them throughout the years, but the parent is going to, again, be that one constant throughout. So we want to make sure that we are establishing shared goals and finding ways that we can communicate regularly. And as we go into those meetings, clarifying our roles and expectations. And then also making sure that we can provide parent support. And that could be through sessions that we have at the school. So, for example, we've done some groups with parents on, how do I advocate? What is an IEP? What are my rights as part of this process? And they can get that information from other sources as well. But bringing that into the school can be helpful, because then it's more accessible to parents. And it can also include some of that family-to-family support as well. So Dr. Adam Weaver, he's also a faculty member at UNO, has put together or had written an article related to some meeting considerations. And this is based off of some of the work from industrial organizational psychology. So I'm going to talk about these three areas briefly. One is the procedural factors to consider. One is the temporal and physical factors. And the last one is facilitative factors. So when we think about procedural factors, it's important for us to contact the parent before the meeting. So we can send home a draft of the IEP, we can send home an agenda, but making an actual contact where we call the family or catch them and chat about, this is the agenda that we had. Is there anything else that you want to include on this? Providing information about who will be attending and how they can share input, or if we need to follow up after the meeting, what that looks like. And also figuring out, what are the parents' goals coming into that meeting? Because when we have everyone's goals in mind, we can focus more on the child's needs and build our plan based off of that. So the next area is with temporal or physical factors. And these have more to do with what the meeting looks like. So we want to make sure that we do have an agenda and a specific meeting start and end time, because we know that everyone is busy. And so when possible, everyone is present at the meeting at the very beginning is ideal. I want to make sure that it's a comfortable space. And one thing when I think about comfortable space is just meeting the parent and walking in with them. So from a parent's perspective, sometimes we have all these people sitting around a table, and then the parent walks in, and it can be very intimidating. But if we have someone that's joining with the parent, having some conversation, building rapport as we're walking into that meeting, talking about their goals, noting some positive things about their child, that meeting, the beginning of that meeting can just feel so much more comfortable for the family. And then also trying to involve as few people as possible. Sometimes when our meetings get so large, it can be harder to do some of that problem solving. So really zooming in on who are the key individuals that we need here to be able to build and facilitate this plan. And then lastly, some of those facilitative strategies. When we walk into some of these meetings, making sure that we know who is going to actually facilitate the meeting, that it's clear that the school psychologist is going to be doing that, or the special educator is going to be doing that, or even the classroom teacher is going to help to facilitate that meeting. Trying to follow the agenda, and very importantly, using effective communication skills. And these can be verbal communication skills as well as nonverbal. So things in that verbal area would be limiting jargon, using reflection. So when the parent brings up a concern or they bring up some strength, reflecting that. That is an awesome thing. I'm so glad that you brought that up about how Mandy really likes being outside. Let's think about how that we can maybe build that in so that school is a really positive place for her. Summarizing information, clarifying if people have questions, providing specific opportunities for parents to give input is also really important, because sometimes it can be kind of scary to speak up, or you're unsure of when to interrupt. And so kind of stopping and providing those opportunities can be helpful for facilitating that conversation. And then also watching our facial expressions, our posture, and considering cultural practices that may be similar or different for the individuals that are in the meeting. And then at the end of our meetings, we want to make sure that we are checking for understanding. It can be, I can't tell you the number of parents who have come into our clinic in the past, and they're unsure if their child is receiving services, or they're unsure of what the goals are for their child on their IEP, or they don't really know what the plan is or how much support they're receiving. And those are really important things for the parent to be able to understand and to feel confident that, the team made good decisions for their child and they're happy with those decisions moving forward. Now, sometimes we are going to have disagreements because at this stage, sometimes our emotions can be heightened. And so it is helpful to provide the staff at the school with some training on how to manage some of that conflict and how to walk through problem solving with the individuals of the team. I think most important, if there's anything that we took from that part, would be to return to the goals that we have for the child and to keep those needs at the forefront, because I think parents, they want their child to be successful, as do teachers. And so when we come back to that primary goal, then everything else can start to fall into place. It may be a process to be able to figure out how we work well as a team, but coming back to that on a regular basis, I think is really helpful. So here's just a couple of examples. So, we're working on these IEP goals. We're excited to work with you. Here's our next meeting date. We look forward to getting your feedback and ideas. It's really clear that we value that information. You can bring someone with you, letting them know who's going to be at the meeting. And then, we can talk about some ways that you can help with that learning at home as well. So in the era of COVID, our meetings, our IEP meetings, may also look a little bit different. And so OSEP, in coordination with several other organizations, have put together some guidelines for facilitating virtual meetings. So things that we may not have had to think about before, but these areas, so being patient with technology, trying out technology, joining the meeting early, actively participating, these are all things that can really get in the way of us building relationships with families during those meetings. And so as much as we can to help each other and help the parent to be able to prepare for that, having, who do we call if my technology isn't working, setting that up in advance, so that meeting can go as similar to an in-person meeting as possible. So I wanted to kind of pull things together here at the end. Sometimes we have, and I have uninvolved families in quotes here, because when we see a family that may seem like they're uninvolved, they may indeed be doing several things outside of the school that we just are unaware of. And so they may be hard to reach, but they're probably not really fully uninvolved when we think about all of those areas or ways that families can be involved. So when we have families that have been hard to reach, I think one of the first steps is to take a step back and think about several questions for ourselves. And these kind of relate directly back to those 4 A's, like as a school or as a classroom, as a teacher, have I made sure that families know that they really are a resource? Have we talked about their roles and responsibilities in facilitating their child's success? What are some of the barriers that are getting in the way? So maybe the parent hasn't come to parent-teacher conferences, but they are working 3 jobs and that doesn't fit into their schedule. How could we arrange that in a different way? Do families really feel like they're partners? Have practices been implemented to involve those families? And have we had some good communication practices in place, or do we need to re-examine those to make sure that families actually are getting the information about ways that they can participate and partner with us? So rather than starting to blame others or to kind of write a family off, we need to take a step back and think about the atmosphere and our attitudes and our actions, all of those areas to kind of build in additional supports or additional structure, and then engage in problem solving with families. So is this information being sent home in a way that, gets to you, that it makes sense? Or is there another time that we can meet for parent-teacher conferences that would better meet your schedule? So we don't have a lot of time for this, but we wanted to include a couple of points for you to kind of take a minute to do some self-reflection. And our slides will be posted, so you can go back and do this. But to rate these conditions in your school community. And so you might rate them on your own and then have a conversation with some of your colleagues or with your school team to think about how you can maybe make some changes to encourage family-school partnerships. So you could think about what are some areas, do we need to improve our approach? Do we need to look at the attitudes and atmosphere before we can come back to those actions? How do we need to facilitate, different opportunities for parents to be involved? And we included several different resources here as well that have some wonderful information about how to, and specific activities and actions that you can also take to improve those family-school partnerships. So as you walk away today, when you click out of this meeting, we would encourage you to try to think about 2 ways that you could foster partnerships. So Amanda talked about some at the beginning, but could you think about 2 more things that when you go back to your school that you might do to connect more with a family or to find out more about resources and what those might be, and kind of setting a goal for yourself on how to go about doing that and then checking in. And you could share those goals with a colleague as well for some accountability. And I think that is all that we have. If we have any questions, I'm going to just stop sharing.
Wow, thank you so much, Sarah and Amanda, for being here with us today and for sharing with us your knowledge, expertise, and experience around the very important work of fostering family, school, and community partnerships. You really went above and beyond with equipping all of us as educators with ideas and strategies and tools to consider and to apply right now in our current settings to build and strengthen these relationships that are so very critical to student success and just enhancing their social and emotional well-being overall. So I did not see any questions coming through in the chat. I am seeing lots of accolades and thank yous, and we again are just so grateful to have you sharing your information with us today. Just wait a couple more minutes. I think. So with that, we are at the end of our time together, but did want to remind all of you participating that our summit sessions are recorded and posted on our Nebraska MTSS website for future reference. And that again, that address is in the chat. And also we hope you'll tune in to the next few weeks of presentations that continue through September 17th. So again, thank you all for taking your time to be with us this afternoon, and we wish you all the best as you begin this school year.
Thanks, Mary Jo. Thanks, everybody, for having us.